Hello, I'm Sheryl McCarthy of the City University of New York. Welcome to One to One. Each week, we address issues of timely and timeless concern with newsmakers and the journalists who report on them, with artists, writers, scientists, educators, social scientists, government leaders. We speak to each one to one. I'm delighted to welcome the writer Jane Ziegelman to the program. Jane is the author of 97 Orchard, an edible history of 5 immigrant families in one New York tenement, which has just been published by HarperCollins. That building, which is a symbol of the history of immigration in New York City, is one we can all visit, since it's the home of the Tenement Museum, and we're going to learn about it as well. Welcome.
Thank you, Sheryl.
97 Orchard, as I said, is the story of 5 immigrant families who lived at this address from the time it was built around 1863 up until just before World War II.
Correct.
And it's about what they cooked and what they ate and how they cooked it and how they found it.
All of that.
What got you interested in this subject?
Okay, I'll try to give you the short
The short
answer.
version.
This book really takes all of my interests and weaves them together in this wonderful way. I grew up in New York, and one of my favorite outings was a walk down on the Lower East Side. It's a neighborhood that, for some reason, speaks to me. I like the scale of the buildings, I like the feel of the streets, and I have some sense when I'm walking there of sort of all of the people that have been there before me. It's a neighborhood where you can still feel the past. When I was in graduate school at NYU, I got hooked up with the people that were starting the Lower East Side Tenement Museum, and I was lucky enough to be hired as someone who collected oral histories from former tenement residents. And one of those people is, in fact, a figure in this book. It's Josephine Baldizzi, who I interviewed back in the 1990s. So that's one half of the story. The other half is the food story. I love food. I like to be around food. I like to talk about food. I like to read about food. When I'm not talking about it, I'm cooking it. And I'm not cooking it, I'm eating it. And sometimes I'm doing all 3 at the same time. So this is a way to combine my interest in this neighborhood and this wonderful business of being around food.
Okay. So talk about the beginnings of 97 Orchard Street. It was built by Lucas Glockner, who was a Gentile German immigrant.
Correct.
Who started out as a tailor and
Correct.
later went in with several partners to build the building from scratch. The building was in some ways more modern than other tenements, and in some ways it was
Exactly right.
typical of the old tenements, right?
That's right. Well, you should know that the first tenements on the Lower East Side were not built as tenements. They were old one-family houses that were converted into multi-family dwellings. They were not particularly nice places to live. They were old, ramshackle. The rooms were extremely small, airless, and the crowding was intense.
Right.
Compared to that, 97 Orchard was a real step up. This was a 5-story brick building where each family has its own apartment, where the windows were decorated with kind of nice trim baseboards along the floor, a nice mantle in the parlor. So there were these wonderful decorative touches all through the building, real kind of symbols of middle-class living,
Right.
or what Glockner saw as
But at the
middle-class
same time, there was
living.
no indoor plumbing
Exactly right.
and
No heat.
no heat. Right. Right.
So it looked good. It was a building with a sense of style about
Right.
it, but there were no frills.
And there was there electricity? Were buildings electrified at that period in time? Okay.
No, but there were buildings with gas.
Okay.
This did not
Okay.
have it.
Okay. So you focus on a German family, the Glockners, an Irish family, a German Jewish family, an Eastern European Jewish family, and an Italian family, who are all part of this great migration to America.
Right.
Immigrants got their first exposure to the American diet at Ellis Island. Talk about the dining room at Ellis Island.
It was an amazing place. I mean, the first thing that you have to remember about Ellis Island is that immigrants received food free, courtesy of the federal government. And for a lot of people coming over with no money in their pockets and who were sort of on a starvation diet, the idea that they had access to fresh milk and meat and bread and butter was extraordinary. So they had to post signs in the dining room, and these were in multiple languages. All food in this dining room is offered free of charge. The immigrants just couldn't believe it. That's one part of the story. The other part of the story is the immensity of the dining room. You have to remember that this dining room served people that were detained on Ellis Island, and there could be 3,000 or more detained on a given day. So this dining room had to feed these 3,000 immigrants 3 meals a day. The room at its largest could accommodate 1,000 people, but it's still, the immigrants still had to eat in shifts.
Right.
So it was in fact New York's biggest public dining facility.
You know, one thing you mentioned that I had not thought about, it was very difficult for Jewish immigrants who kept kosher, because at first, before they got the kosher dining room, you know, the food was not kosher, and if you were trying to adhere to the rules, you couldn't eat it. So you could practically, I guess you could practically starve at Ellis Island.
Yeah, you had a choice. You know, follow the religious laws and starve, or break the religious dietary laws and survive. And people actually went both ways.
Right.
Some people did sort of deny themselves nourishment in order to maintain kashrut. Others saw the necessity of eating and realized they were in tough straits, and they strayed.
Right.
But their problems really started on the way over, on the ships, which did not offer any kind of kosher food. So these Jews arrived in really poor shape.
Right, right. So the immigrants who are fortunate enough to be passed through Ellis Island, they wind up on the Lower East Side, where they live in boarding houses or in the tenement buildings or from one to the other. If you were a wife and a mother, what went into trying to feed an immigrant, immigrant families? What went into feeding a family on the Lower East Side in the late 19th and early 20th centuries?
Well, the first thing that struck me about the role of the home cook is the tremendous athleticism that it required. To cook a meal, the first thing you had to do, if you were going to put anything on the stove, is go down to the yard and schlep up a basin or some kind of tub of water. And women were constantly going up and down those stairs with either water or food or children or coal or wood in their arms or on their backs. So they were really the sort of the human freight elevators, is what I call them, of this period. That was part of the story. Another thing that impressed me was their ingenuity, how they could take a scrap of this and a little piece of that and a splash of something else and somehow put it together into a meal. So, for instance, maybe a couple of chicken wings and, the cheapest part of the bird, some potatoes, water for the soup. And immigrants cooked with lots of water, but they used these materials and fashioned them into something nourishing and kept their families alive.
And they're cooking on what, coal and wood stoves?
They were cooking on coal and wood-burning stoves. Eventually, they did have gas burners. So this was,
Of course, then you've also got to shop, which takes up a lot of
Yes.
time. The Lower East Side, and we have gotten glimpses of it from movies like Hester Street, Ragtime, even Godfather Part 2. It was crowded, it was poor, it was teeming with push carts. Talk about the Pushcart Markets.
The Pushcart Markets first of all, the entire neighborhood was in essence a pushcart market. Some streets more crowded than others. Orchard Street was a main pushcart thoroughfare, so was Essex, Rivington. And here the pushcarts were absolutely back to back, line to line, all up and down the curbs. To buy something from a pushcart was not the nice, quiet interaction that we're used to when we go to the supermarket, where we put our things on the conveyor belt and the stuff is rung up and we hand the money and no words are exchanged. Shopping was a really loud, talkative activity. There was lots of intense bargaining, and this was not bargaining for fun. This was bargaining to get that extra piece of cabbage or that extra piece of herring that was going to feed, the last kid. So this was really bargaining to survive. One
of the things I was surprised it was one of the most popular foods sold on the street in this period were oysters.
Yeah, that's it.
Now, first of all, how did you keep them fresh, when you're selling them from a push cart?
Right. Well, they did have ice.
They did?
But
okay.
Also, I'm sure a lot of the oysters went bad and a lot of people got sick off oysters. That's the part of the story they don't tell, but I'm sure it went on.
The Glockners were Germans who were considered the model minority at the time.
That's right.
And somewhat better off than some of the other immigrants you write about in the book. What kinds of foods did the German immigrants contribute to American cuisine?
I would say, aside from the Frankfurters and the sauerkraut, these are now foods that we eat on the 4th of July. So this is a German food that has been so completely assimilated that we've almost erased its German roots.
Right.
There were also coffee cakes. All of those coffee cakes that we're making in our Midwestern kitchens and that we're eating at our brunches, that's a German food that was brought over in the mid-19th century. Perhaps, however, the most important food was not a food, but a beverage, and that was beer. The Germans are the group that brought us lager beer. At first, Americans resisted the taste of the lager. They were used to a sweeter, less fizzy version of beer. It was a British ale. But as soon as it caught on, and it didn't take long, there was a beer explosion, and it very quickly became our national beverage.
One thing that's interesting is that German food was the most popular food among other Americans at the time, but that went out of favor, and not so many people eat the heavy German type food today. But at that particular time, it was the favorite immigrant food among Americans, partly because the Germans were the model minority.
Exactly right. I mean, this is what I found, is that native-born Americans kind of projected their feelings about the immigrants onto the foods they ate. So they welcomed the Germans,
so
they welcomed their food.
Very interesting.
Now, the Italians didn't have it so good.
Right, and we're going to talk about that.
There was tremendous Italian prejudice, and there was prejudice toward
against
the food as well. Right.
And we turned on the German food during World War I.
Exactly right.
Interesting.
That's right.
We're going to take a break, and then we'll be back with more with Jane Ziegelman, author of 97 Orchard, after the following message.
Mom, I'm not going to go to college.
What are you saying? You've got to go to college.
Well, they offered me a job, and...
Son, college is much more important.
No.
Yes.
No, Mom.
Yes.
Anyways, it's my decision.
Okay, well then decide what degree you're going to get, because you will go to college.
Their tomorrow depends on your words today. The Hispanic Scholarship Fund has the information you need to help your kids go to college.
Welcome back to One to One. I'm Sheryl McCarthy of the City University of New York, and I'm talking with Jane Ziegelman, author of 97 Orchard, an edible history of 5 immigrant families in one New York tenement. It's just been published by HarperCollins. Now, the Moore family were Irish, and the Irish came here, because of the famine. The Irish had the most sparse cuisine of any group who came here, because even back home, they were eating potatoes basically, and probably some kind of dark bread. So, how did they influence American cuisine?
They played an interesting role in our culinary development, and in a way, they're the real odd men out in this story. They were really effective culinary chameleons. They, instead of bringing over a very highly developed culinary tradition, they very quickly sussed out what was going on in this country in terms of the foods that we were eating and how we were selling them. And they played a role, they entered our food economy and played a very important role in feeding the rest of New York. So for instance, Irish women became domestic cooks. And through their exposure in these middle-class households, very quickly learned how an American is supposed to eat. They had this close exposure to American cooking that other groups did not have. Irish men were really important players in the New York restaurant business. And in some ways, they set us on a particular restaurant trajectory. It was Irish immigrants who really helped invent the idea of the lunchroom.
Okay.
This was a businessman's eating place, and it's really the ancestor to our coffee shops.
Okay.
So they did a lot, but they did it quietly.
Okay. The Gumperts were German Jewish from Prussia. He was a shoemaker who abandoned his wife and children.
Correct.
How did she support herself? Was she the one who became the sort of the janitor of the building?
No, that's Mrs. Rogoshevsky.
Okay.
But they both, unfortunately, one was abandoned by her husband, the other was left a widow, and they were both left with families to support. She became a seamstress, and she was really successful. We don't know if she had any professional background as a seamstress, but whether or not she did, she saw what needed to be done. She had 4 young kids, and she swung into action. She became somebody who made dresses to order out of her apartment, and she taught her daughters the same trade.
2 words, gefilte fish.
Why? Okay, this is gefilte fish. It can be a problematic food for people who have not grown up eating it. It looks funny and it tastes funny. It is, however, a really important food on the Jewish holiday table. There's all kinds of religious symbolism associated with the gefilte fish, but it's also a demonstration of the prowess of the home cook. There's so much work that goes into making a gefilte fish. And if you're making it the real sort of old-fashioned way, you need a really delicate hand to make it properly. So to produce a gefilte fish shows that you really know how to cook. In a way, it's like it's a status food for the home cook.
And I realize, I mean, is it always cod, or is it different kinds of fish?
No, cod is not a traditional fish. It's not? The traditional fish are pike, carp, whitefish.
Okay.
These are all fish that you would have found in Eastern Europe. Over here, we're beginning to play now with the kinds of fish that are permissible in a gefilte fish. And I recently made a sustainable gefilte fish. So I used Arctic char and striped bass, very unconventional. But the idea is that you're taking this mixture of fish. Some are fatty, some are lean, chopping them really fine, mixing them, binding them with some other ingredients, and then simmering them. In its original format, a gefilte fish, and gefilte means stuffed, was in fact a whole fish restuffed.
But now it's not. It's the innards that you...
Well, now it's just these little balls sort of ovals or loaves. So it's a kind of homier version of the original.
Pickles.
Yes.
What was the fascination of pickles? I mean, there was even concern that Jewish children, school children, were eating too many pickles and it was making them nervous.
That's right. There was a kind of pickle hysteria, and it broke out in the early part of the 20th century when various native-born citizens went down to the Lower East Side. Some were sociologists, some were doctors, some were nurses, some were dietitians, and saw this tremendous affection that Jewish kids in particular, but not only Jewish kids, many different ethnic tenement kids, tenement kids from different ethnicities, had for pickles. And the pickle became a kind of a scapegoat, a symbolic scapegoat of everything that was wrong with the immigrant diet. And Americans sort of launched into this campaign to put down the pickle.
Okay. So then we had the Rogoshevskys, who were Jews from Eastern Europe.
Correct.
And they brought, among other things, the knish.
Yes.
And you got, I didn't realize that the Jews brought us this vegetarian tradition in this country.
Yeah, interesting, because we think of the Jewish diet as so rooted in meat, big, heavy briskets and innards and liver, and well, that's just one way to eat Jewish. There is this vegetarian tradition, and it was reflected in the dairy restaurants. It's kind of a dying breed, but at one time, this city had a whole slew of these great places that you could go for just fish, vegetables, and dairy-based dishes. One of the great old places was Ratner's. It was on Delancey Street. It's a place that I used to go with my grandmother. And if you wanted a nice cup of cold borscht, this was the place to go. It was wonderful summer eating.
What do you think, what were the Jewish immigrants, what were their main contributions to the culinary life of America? What do you think some of the main ones were?
I would have to start with the bagel.
Ah, yes, the bagel.
We can't ignore the bagel. Maybe we don't even remember that it's Jewish. It's just a bagel now. But bagels, when Native Americans sort of first discovered that the Jews were eating these very chewy, they called them hard rolls, they were not impressed. They referred to the bagel as a donut with rigor mortis. So the love affair was not instantaneous, but it is now a completely Americanized food, and you can get it everywhere, not just in New York.
I wish we had more time to talk about the Baldizzis, the Italians, but we don't have much time. But the Italians really came here, and a lot of them were very, very poor construction workers, and they had an extremely sparse diet. Sometimes just stale bread and water. And I was amazed to read about how a lot of Italians were digging around in the garbage trying to get, thrown away vegetables, from restaurants and other places, and trying to cobble meals out of that. Foraging for dandelions. Was dandelion soup, was it good?
Dandelions are delicious.
Really?
Oh, yeah.
Okay.
And they're wonderful in salads.
Okay.
The Italians, nobody could eat vegetables better than the Italians. And of all their contributions, there's pasta and there's pizza, there's all kinds of great Italian foods. I think Italians really taught us how to eat vegetables.
And as they got a little more money and, were able to bring their own foods here, they really enriched American cuisine, because Italian foods, the pastas and what else are we talking about? What other kinds of things? Well, vegetables, certainly.
Vegetables like the raviolis and the lasagnas, and not to mention the cannolis and the wonderful Italian pastries.
Right. And have become very popular, even though they were not popular then because it was Italian food.
That's exactly right.
So how healthy were the people of Lower East Side, given their poverty and their scrounging? Was a diet a factor in their health?
Oh, yes, it certainly was. It cut both ways. There are, lots of mortality studies of who was living and who was dying on the Lower East Side. And in many cases, officials were surprised at how healthy these East Siders seemed to be, considering the conditions they were living in.
Right.
On the other hand, I think perhaps one of the biggest dangers, food-based dangers, was contamination, and particularly contaminated milk. And unfortunately, the victims of that were the kids, were the children.
Yeah. I found this book just fascinating and so interesting. I wish we had more time that we could talk more about it, but you have to read the book. And go to the Tenement Museum.
Yes.
We're out of time, but I want to thank Jane Ziegelman, author of 97 Orchard, An Edible History of 5 Immigrant Families in One New York Tenement, published by HarperCollins. For the City University and 1-to-1, I'm Sheryl McCarthy.